Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 people who disappeared and were found in extremely strange places. In fact, the final story will probably make your shortlist for the worst place a person can ever end up. It's truly the stuff of nightmares. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. As Scary Interesting has gotten more popular, as you might imagine, I've naturally become a little more concerned about privacy and security, and especially anytime I'm working away from my home office and on public Wi-Fi. That's when a VPN is basically essential. A VPN encrypts your internet connection, creating a secure tunnel between your device and the web. This protects sensitive data like passwords and banking information while on public Wi-Fi. It also routes your connection through one of their 4,500 servers all around the world, making it appear as though you're browsing from that region. Beyond the security this provides, this allows you to access location-specific deals and content. Like for example, as a Canadian, streaming services typically show only the Canadian catalog, but with Surfshark, you can access content from any region where they have servers. This also extends to all sorts of price deals, letting you find better offers based on location. Maybe the best part, though, is that even with their most basic plan, you can use it on an unlimited number of devices. This means you can keep your entire house protected with a single subscription. And finally, beyond just their VPN, Surfshark also offers a data breach alert system that notifies you as soon as your email, ID, credit card, or other personal information gets leaked online. This means you're able to take action and change passwords or anything else to keep yourself protected as soon as it happens. So right now, you can get 4 extra months free of Surfshark VPN by going to my link in the description or by going to https://surfshark.com/scare. They also have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a try. And with all of that said, let's get into today's video. In many respects, 61-year-old Mary Cerruti was the stereotypical twice-divorced cat lady. She lived alone, worked part-time, and doted on her adopted street cats like they were human children she never had. Friends and coworkers regularly checked on Mary because she was small, frail, and not in the best of health. So needless to say, everyone was worried sick when she disappeared in the spring of 2014 without even a goodbye. Mary was born on June 12, 1954 in Kingsville, Texas. Her father was an academic and her mother was a traditional homemaker. Mary didn't have any brothers or sisters, but she apparently had a happy and relatively uneventful upper-middle-class childhood. Sadly, that changed abruptly in the summer of 1967 when she was 13 years old. According to a local newspaper, Mary was eating supper with her parents on August 29th when her mother suddenly fell face-first into her dinner plate. She would tragically die later that night, leaving Mary and her father to continue on afterward. After graduating from high school, Mary began attending the University of Houston. Her father stayed behind because by then he was a dean at the Texas College of Arts and Industries in Kingsville. However, he would also pass away in mid-February of 1974, leaving Mary without any close family because her closest living relatives were distant cousins who she never saw and rarely spoke to. Either way, Mary continued studying at the University of Houston and married a man named David Cerruti in early January of 1979 when she was 24 years old. She then dropped out shortly afterward without having earned her degree, and she and her new husband settled in Montrose, Texas, just a few blocks southwest of downtown Houston. She then got a job at a cafe, and pretty much all we know after that is that she and David divorced in late 1990 when she was in her mid-30s. They never had any children, and it's unclear what caused their marriage to fall apart, but whatever the case, Mary tied the knot again just 2 months later. This time it was to a man named Roy Elliott, who apparently had no fewer than 5 failed marriages under his belt. Unsurprisingly, their marriage didn't even last a year. After that, Mary started a pet-sitting business and settled into a quiet life as an aging divorcee. At the age of 47, she bought a little 1-story bungalow with an attic at 610 Alston Street in Houston's historic Houston Heights neighborhood. To make some extra money, she got a job at a craft store nearby, and when she wasn't working, she spent much of her time trapping stray cats and taking them to clinics to get them spayed and neutered. She would even keep a few of them as house pets. Mary was also active in the community, and she regularly attended Houston Planning Commission meetings where she was well known for fighting lawyers and executives from big development companies. She apparently did whatever she could to prevent them from turning her beloved neighborhood into what some might describe as a soulless cookie-cutter subdivision. All of this is to say that Mary seemed to be content with the quiet life she carved out for herself. She didn't have much money, but she kept her finances in order and her home and yard in tip-top shape. She also hung heavy tapestries over some of her downstairs windows. This was partly to block out the piercing Houston sun, but also partly because she just liked the privacy. All of this culminated in the spring of 2014 when Mary stopped going to work and stopped making her mortgage payments. Mary's boss and representatives from the bank tried contacting her multiple times to see what was going on, but she never answered the phone or returned any of their emails or voicemails. At the same time, Mary didn't come to the door like she usually did when her friends and neighbors dropped by to make sure she was okay. And thanks to the tapestries over the windows, they couldn't see inside the bungalow. Over the next few months, her neighbors also noticed a broken window that went unrepaired and a pile of untouched mail that accumulated on the front porch. One friend became so worried by August that he called the police and reported Mary missing. Officers then conducted a welfare check at her house on Alston Street later that day. They banged on the door and identified themselves over and over, and when nobody answered, they forced their way in. Inside the house, what they found was kind of disturbing. They found 6 dead cats in various stages of decomposition. They also discovered that the refrigerator was full of food and that none of Mary's clothes, household goods, or personal possessions seemed to be missing. But as for Mary herself, she was nowhere to be found. Investigators also didn't find any evidence of foul play inside the house. As far as they could tell, Mary had been there 1 minute and up and disappeared the next. In that time, she missed almost an entire year's worth of mortgage payments before the bank began foreclosing proceedings early the following year. As a result, her personal items were eventually sold at an estate sale, and the bank sold her home at auction later that year. As hard as it was to accept, Mary's friends, neighbors, and coworkers eventually came to the realization that they'd never see her again. With that said, though, they always suspected that she didn't disappear willingly. Deep down, they all knew she would never abandon her cats or her little house or leave in the middle of the night without at least saying goodbye. New homeowners eventually moved into her old house, and one day in early March of 2017, about 3 years after Mary disappeared, they began ripping out a section of old drywall next to the bathroom on the first floor. It didn't take much to get the brittle old drywall off the warped studs, and they knew they'd find dust, grime, dead bugs, and maybe some rodent droppings in the narrow recess behind the old wall. And they did, but they also found eyeglasses, some clothing, a pair of stained shoes, and an intact skeleton along with an almost entirely flesh-free human skull. Forensic pathologists determined that the bones were from a relatively small and frail Caucasian woman over 40 years old. In other words, a woman just like Mary. At that point, everyone assumed it was her because the clothes, shoes, and glasses found on the wall also matched descriptions of what her friends and coworkers said she wore around the house. The medical examiner couldn't determine the exact cause of death, but no signs of trauma were found on the bones, and this indicated that she wasn't murdered and disposed of behind the wall. It would take more than a year to prove that the bones belonged to 61-year-old Mary Cerruti because of her lack of close family, but by the time they did, investigators had a pretty good idea of how she ended up behind the wall all the way back in 2014. While searching the attic after the new homeowners found the bones, they discovered a suspicious broken floorboard directly over the portion of the wall where Mary's remains were found. The hole in the floor itself wasn't very big, and at only about 8 inches or 20 centimeters wide, the space between the two walls where Mary was found wasn't much bigger. To put that into perspective, that's just half an inch narrower than the width of a standard sheet of paper. Investigators concluded that Mary had been messing around in the attic that day when one of the floorboards beneath her cracked and buckled. Fractions of a second later, she slid down into the narrow space between the walls and fell straight down to the first floor. It's not clear how long she survived in that space, but there are a few possibilities. The first is that the fall itself killed her, but it wasn't a very high height. The second is that the space was so small that she asphyxiated. And the final and maybe most horrifying is that she survived long enough to eventually die of dehydration, meaning she might have spent days trapped there before finally succumbing. In either case, it is truly disturbing. Most people don't give storm drains a second thought. You drive over them and walk past them all the time. You might notice them when there's a big puddle after a rainstorm, but that's about it. They're just sort of part of the background of everyday life. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is that storm drains are their own separate system, completely different from the pipes that carry sewage. Their only job is to collect rainwater from streets, parking lots, and sidewalks and move it somewhere else before it can cause flooding. When a heavy rain hits, all that water has to go somewhere, and usually it drops into a network of underground pipes that stretch for literal miles beneath cities and suburbs. It's a simple idea, but the scale of it is enormous. Across the United States alone, there are millions of miles of these underground channels and hundreds of millions of individual drains that feed into them. Most of the time, these storm drain systems do their work quietly, but when something goes wrong or when someone ends up where they don't belong, storm drains can become incredibly dangerous places. During floods, water can surge through them with terrifying force, strong enough to knock people off their feet and pull them inside. The water can also be ice cold even in warm weather, and the tunnels are dark and confusing. Once you're in there, it can be very hard to tell which way leads back out. As a result of these factors, there have been dozens of cases over the years where people have been swept into storm drains, pipes, or culverts during storms. A large number of those cases ended in death, and sadly, many of the victims were children. There also isn't a single national system that tracks all of these incidents, and this means that the real number is probably higher than what shows up in reports and news stories. What makes all of this even more unsettling is the normal-looking nature of storm drains from the outside. Some are just metal grates in the middle of a street, while others are wide concrete openings along creeks or drainage channels. For kids, they can look like something to explore, and for someone who's scared, confused, or not thinking clearly, they can look like a place to hide. But in either case, once someone goes inside without the proper safety gear and equipment, the whole world seems to change as light disappears and sound echoes off walls in strange ways. Even people who work in these systems have to follow strict safety rules when they go down there because it's so easy to get lost or hurt. And this is exactly where a woman found herself fighting for her life for reasons that are still yet to be explained. The woman was a 59-year-old married woman living in downtown San Diego, and sometime around midnight on March 25, 2025, she got in her car and drove away from her Union Street home. That's the last time anyone is known to have seen her. No one knew where she was going or if she was going to meet up with someone, but as the hours passed and then turned into days without her return, it became clear that something wasn't right. A week later, on April 2nd, police found her car parked near the Beeler Canyon trailhead, about 36 kilometers from her home, but that scene was just as confusing as her disappearance itself. Her personal belongings were just scattered around the car, which immediately raised concerns. After police came across the scene and determined who the car was registered to, they reached out to the woman's husband. The next day, which was more than a week after she was last seen, he filed a missing persons report. By April 4th, the San Diego Police Department went public with the case and appealed to those in the area to keep an eye out for a missing woman. They described her as being at risk if they didn't elaborate in their press release. Investigators started by pinging her cell phone, and they were able to trace its last known signal to an area near Beeler Canyon Road, not far from where her car was discovered. By Monday, April 7th, investigators were still working in the area around Beeler Canyon Road, trying to piece together what might have happened. At that point, the search had already stretched on for nearly 2 weeks, but that afternoon something happened that nobody was expecting. Officers were in the area searching for her when they suddenly heard a woman's voice calling out. At first, it wasn't even clear where the sound was coming from, but as they listened more closely, it became clear that the sound was coming from below them, somewhere beneath a manhole cover. Once that realization set in, the scene changed dramatically. Within a short time, there were 8 fire rescue vehicles on site, and personnel were preparing to enter the underground labyrinth of tight tunnels and passageways. As the search continued, crews began working their way uphill along a path of the storm drain, and that's when they finally started to get closer to her location. As this was happening, another manhole cover was lifted, and the voice coming from below confirmed that its source was nearby. When the first rescue personnel went down into the underground system, they were met with low ceilings, narrow passages, water, and garbage that had been brought in by storm water. There was even no standing room in many spots, which meant they had to crawl forward on their stomachs, pulling themselves along while carrying lights and rescue equipment, but they kept moving in the direction of the voice, and finally, one of the teams reached her. She was about 10 feet or 3 meters below the surface, and while she was alive, she was clearly in medical trouble. After an estimated several days at least in that environment, her body was struggling. Once she was above ground, she was rushed to the nearest hospital in serious condition. For a short while, there was still hope that she might recover enough to tell someone what had happened to her and how she ended up in a storm drain miles from her home. But less than 2 hours after she was brought back into daylight, she tragically passed away. News of her death turned what had briefly looked like a rare rescue into a tragedy and left numerous unanswered questions. Like, for example, what was she doing on Beeler Canyon Road so far away from home, and why would she have gone there at midnight on the evening of her disappearance? And how had she gotten into a storm drain in the first place, and how long had she been there? There was no sign that she had fallen through an open manhole cover in the street, and with each cover weighing around 100 pounds, it was unlikely that someone of her stature could pry one of them up to get to the system. One of the most likely possibilities was that she entered through one of the large openings where the drain empties. If she entered through one of these openings, it wouldn't have taken long for her to end up lost deep inside the system. Storm drains slope and twist, and once you move away from the opening, the light fades quickly. From the rescue effort as well, firefighters told investigators that she was in some kind of altered mental state, but that could also be expected considering where she was found. Dehydration, exhaustion, illness, or the stress of just being trapped could all lead to that kind of condition. However, if any of the many questions about the case of her disappearance and discovery have been answered through investigation, none of that information has been made public. There's no further word on where she was going, how she ended up on Beeler Canyon Road, how she ended up in the storm drain system, or how long she spent there before she was found. There's also nothing on why it took the police notifying her husband of the discovery of her vehicle a week after she disappeared before he finally reported her missing. As of the publishing of this video, much about her disappearance and death remain a mystery. Tensions were running high in a village on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi on the morning of March 26, 2017. A 25-year-old man named Akbar had failed to return home the day before after leaving to do some work. When he didn't come back overnight, his family got word and contacted the police. Search efforts then got underway, but no sign of the farmer turned up until the grounds of the palm oil plantation he worked at were scoured. There, a mysterious scene was discovered. Palm fruit was found scattered on the ground, a harvesting tool was located nearby, and one of his boots was lying out in the open, yet he was nowhere to be found. The day he disappeared was about as normal and routine as any. A married father of 2 young children, Akbar engaged in the physical, repetitive work of palm oil farming to support his family. He prepared to head out as he normally would, gathering his tools and setting off toward the plantation with plans to harvest and then return later in the day. Akbar was last seen walking toward the grove and disappearing between the trees with his equipment. As the day wore on and evening came without his return, no one thought much of it. Delays happened and work on a palm oil plantation often ran long, but when night fell without any sign of him, concern began to grow. By the next morning, worry had turned to urgency and his family began asking around the village. A small search party was then organized and people began moving through the palm groves, calling out his name and scanning around for any trace of Akbar's presence at the plantation. That's when searchers began finding scattered signs that he had reached the plantation and started working, but these discoveries raised immediate concerns, particularly the lone boot lying in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't long into the search that morning when someone noticed a snake lying in a ditch nearby, and immediately it garnered plenty of attention. Now, reticulated pythons are common to the region, but the snake was larger than most people had seen up close. It was estimated to be about 23 feet or 7 meters long, but its unusual width was what was most concerning. Its body was so large through the middle and stretched so wide that it dragged against the ground when it tried to shift. Reticulated pythons also tend to stay away from humans, but even as a crowd of villagers gathered around it, the snake didn't seem interested in getting away, if it even could. Whatever was inside it was far larger than the pigs or wild dogs that occasionally went missing in the area. People then immediately began to connect the details. The snake was close to where Akbar's belongings had been found, and it had clearly eaten something far bigger than its usual prey. As the crowd formed around the snake, some villagers mentioned that during the night they heard cries coming from the palm grove. Pretty quickly, everyone realized that those screams were likely coming from Akbar. The snake was then restrained to be examined more closely, and the decision was made to cut it open, but by that point, most people present already believed they knew what they were going to find inside. A long knife was used to carefully open the python's stomach, and as the blade cut through its thick skin, the air around the ditch grew heavy. When the opening widened, fabric appeared almost immediately, and a human body began to emerge. It was Akbar, still clothed with his body fully intact. Horrifyingly, video and photos taken of the scene documented the entire process. The footage showed the slow removal of Akbar's body as the python was peeled back. In several frames, the one boot he was still wearing could be seen clearly. Confirmation of Akbar being discovered spread quickly beyond the village. Images and video were shared with the local media, and within hours, the story was circulating far beyond Sulawesi. In fact, Akbar's wife, who was not in the village at the time of his disappearance, learned what happened to her husband when she saw those same images and reports from news outlets. It was just a horrific tragedy all around, and one that might have been many years in the making. Before we get to that though, it helps to go over what a reticular python is and how it kills. They're known to be some of the biggest reptiles and the longest snake species on Earth. Native to Southeast Asia, among other regions, they can reach lengths well over 20 feet or 6 meters. Some can grow even larger, with estimates exceeding 30 feet or 9 meters in rare cases. Adult reticulated pythons often weigh more than 100 pounds and are powerful enough to attack large animals, although they don't rely on venom to incapacitate their prey. Instead, they use their bodies. When a python strikes, it grabs its prey with its jaws and immediately wraps its body around the victim. Each time its prey exhales, the snake tightens its grip to shut down blood circulation. For a long time, people assumed constricting snakes killed by suffocation, but recent research has shown that isn't the case. The pressure from a large python cuts off blood flow, preventing the heart from pumping effectively. Once circulation stops, loss of consciousness can happen quickly, followed by death not long after. In a snake as large as the one that consumed Akbar, that process can take only seconds. After killing its prey, a python doesn't rush to eat. It takes its time to reposition the body for consumption, usually starting with the head. The snake's jaws aren't hinged in the way people often think, but the bones are loosely connected and supported by elastic ligaments, allowing the mouth to stretch far wider than what might seem possible. In the case of humans, the shoulders often prove to be the main challenge, but beyond that point, the body narrows, making full consumption physically possible for a snake of that size. Once swallowed, the snake's muscles slowly work the body downward and digestion begins. Thankfully, despite how shocking the outcome was, there is little reason to believe that Akbar was swallowed alive. The constriction that occurs before consumption makes survival after capture extremely unlikely. Humans, however, are not normal prey for pythons, and that's what made Akbar's death different from anything documented before. As shocking as his death was, though, many experts believed it was only a matter of time before something like that occurred. Reticulated pythons usually avoid human settlements. They are actually secretive animals that spend much of their time hidden, hunting, and moving mostly at night, but changes to land have brought about changes in the snake's behavior. The area where Akbar was working was once rainforest land that had been cleared and reshaped for agriculture. Indonesia is the world's largest producer of palm oil, and the crop is used in countless everyday products, from food to cosmetics, so the number of plantations has continually grown. As that's happened though, natural habitats have shrunk, and species that once stayed deep in the rainforest have been forced to adapt. The absence of dense rainforest nearby limited other hunting options, and Akbar, who was alone and focused on his work, was vulnerable prey for the snake. And what's maybe most alarming is that the conditions that allowed him to be targeted and eaten by the python have become more common, not less. When news of Akbar's death spread, much of the shock came from the fact that it was believed to be the first fully documented case of a reticulated python killing and consuming an adult human. In the years that followed, though, similar cases began to surface. In June of 2018, just over a year after Akbar's death, a 54-year-old woman went missing in another part of Sulawesi. When villagers searched the area, they found a large python nearby, and like Akbar, she was later recovered from inside the snake. Then in 2022, another missing woman disappeared in Jambi on the island of Sumatra, and the outcome was the same. A reticulated python was captured and her body was found inside. Then in 2024, 2 more cases occurred in South Sulawesi within weeks of each other. In both incidents, women were reported missing after routine daily activities, and large pythons were found nearby and later opened, revealing the victims inside. Even as recently as July of 2025, a 63-year-old man was killed and consumed by a reticulated python while feeding livestock in southwest Sulawesi. Akbar's death, it seems, marked the beginning of a shift in what once sounded impossible has now turned into a concerning trend for those living and working around palm oil plantations in the region. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.